All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm just going to move my mic just a little closer to my mouth, so presumably you'll hear me a little bit better with this microphone. The preferred distance is about 6 inches or so. I think that's about how far my mouth is from the tip of the microphone. Give me a call. I'd love to talk to you. We had a great chat yesterday with Arlen, but you did not join me, so I'd love to have you as part of the conversation. 240-242-5646. And I also would love it if you aren't yet subscribing. If you did, in fact, subscribe. We need more subscribers. I need more subscribers. I have been very, very hopeful, optimistic, goal-oriented here, which is to have this live stream at some point start to pay me a little bit, not what a real job. I mean, in the end, maybe if I'm like a Jimmy Dore or someone like that, but the odds aren't great, perhaps. But we live in hope, and I do have that arrogance to believe I do a really, really good program that's pretty unique. So if we can just get, I thought it was 1,000. I thought I needed 1,000 subscribers. I'm pretty far from 1,000. It turns out 500 subscribers, and YouTube, Google will start sending me money. So it would be great if you can just, and I never ask, I would never even dream of asking folks who whose economic condition is totally unknown to me, asking you to send me money. I wouldn't do that, and I won't accept it. So don't even consider that, please. But do subscribe. And hey, if you really want to do me a favor, get others to subscribe as well. I'm not doing this for the money, but it would be gratifying for me. It would feel like I'm making progress. It would put wind in my sails. So just 500 subscribers. It's funny because we all, I assume we all do. I certainly do watch mostly, not invariably, but mostly YouTube videos from hosts who have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of subscribers. And I think that gives us a skewed notion of the average number of subscribers that most YouTubers have. And I think the numbers are in the dozens, maybe in the low hundreds. So if you get to 500, you're doing pretty darn well compared to most, and then hopefully it snowballs. So again, I ask you to like and to subscribe. And if you don't like and you don't want to subscribe, tell me why. Tell me why when you're watching this live stream, you're like, oh gosh, Al, you suck. I don't want anything to do with you. Of course, probably you're not listening or watching anymore, but to the extent you hear that, yeah, I would appreciate any negative feedback as well. Certainly constructive criticism would be lovely. Okay, I wanted to get, now it is Black History Month. I've heard a lot of people, both African-American and not African-American, criticize the idea of having one sort of segregated month, if you will. The shortest month of the year, it's sometimes pointed out, is relegated to or devoted to Black history, which is kind of ridiculous, obviously, because Black history is part of American history. African-American history is part of American history, certainly, and you can't limit it, and one should not limit it to any particular month. But that said, there is value in perhaps recognizing a specific focus on the experiences of African Americans. That's not why I'm talking about Coleman Hughes. I was really interested in this article, and because Coleman Hughes seems to, based on what the New York Times says, and also a video, I'll play a short clip of an over an hour debate Mr. Hughes had with Jamel Bowie, not one of my favorite columnists at the New York Times, which is kind of hard to not be one of my favorite columnists because I guess they're all really pretty bad. I mean, I don't think he's very good. I certainly don't think Krugman is good. We'll hear a little bit, or I'll show you a portion of something Thomas Edsall wrote. I guess he's on balance the one I dislike the least. I used to really sometimes enjoy Bob Herbert's columns, but he's gone. He was probably the conscience of the New York Times op-ed page. He is no longer with them. I was really taken by this article. By the way, hat tip to my mom who brought this to my attention. She knew after reading it that I would likely share the same views as Coleman Hughes, or perhaps it's better to say, given that he's, I'm sure, well, I think he's certainly less than half my age, that he would more likely share my view. Not saying that he's consciously or subconsciously integrated what I've had to say into his worldview. Probably he doesn't ever heard what I have to say, but to the extent he may have, sure, I'll take a little bit of credit for it. The first thing that struck me is the title of this article. And this is as much about the New York Times and how it spins, how it biases you against truly what I would call, I think it's hard to argue they're not, truly progressive policies. And when I say progressive, I mean designed to move us forward, to progress society in a positive direction, one where in the end, as I've often said, everyone has enough, no one has too much. That's not the end-all, be-all. I mean, that's critically important. And if we have a society where we all have enough and nobody has too much, we're much, much more likely to tackle other issues like the climate holocaust, like endless war. We were able to accomplish a tremendous amount in the 1960s when wealth and income inequality were much less than they are now, when there was a tighter safety net and when many fewer people had too much. I mean, some had too much, but fewer did. And those who had too much didn't have that much more that was too much compared to today when you have wealth and income inequality rivaling that of ancient Egypt. I was really struck. The young black conservative, they are trying clearly to bias their readers against Coleman Hughes by calling him a conservative. The New York Times, well known as a liberal newspaper, its readership is almost certainly going to self-describe largely, mainly as liberal. This is, after all, the New York Times. New York is one of the most democratic states. New York, the most democratic of cities. So this is clearly designed to immediately make you start thinking, wait, what's wrong with this guy? Why he's black and he's a conservative? That doesn't make any sense to me. And his worldview does conflict directly with African Americans who are prominent at the New York Times. Specifically, I'm thinking, of course, of Jamel Bowie, who did debate Hughes, but also Charles Blow. So is Coleman Hughes a conservative? They use that term to besmirch him, to say, well, you shouldn't listen to him. He rejects DEI. That's how we know he's a conservative. That's what is apparently the definition of a conservative, is someone who rejects, especially if they're black. He's a black conservative. He's black and he rejects diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is obviously a conscious effort. It's not color blindness. It's color recognition in specific policies by universities, employers, institutions, and the like. We're going to make a conscious effort to have more African American students, more, quote, students of color, except if the color happens to be yellow, Asians, right? We're not going to have more Asians, or they're brown, but they're brown from India. We're not going to have more students of color if those are their colors, because we already have too many, would be the attitude of those who are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's already plenty of diversity on many college campuses when it comes to those specific students of color. So he's saying that's ridiculous. He's saying equity, where we try to balance the scales, where each institution tries to balance the scales based on identity, and making sure we have these inclusive campuses where we include lots of people of different colors. He's like, no, I don't support that. And according to the New York Times, that makes him a conservative. I say that's a narrow and divisive definition of progressive, because they're saying you can only be a progressive if you embrace DEI. But I would say Coleman Hughes is clearly progressive, once you read the article, once you hear him speak, he is laser focused on improving the quality of life of poor, struggling, and working Americans, which includes, of course, a disproportionate number of blacks. So to argue he's not progressive is redefining the term. It's saying progressive isn't being on the side of those who have less. Progressive isn't on the side of working class Americans. Progressive isn't being on the side of the have-nots or the poor. Progressive is on the side of people based on their identity, their racial identity, their ethnic identity. And I'm calling BS on that. I'm saying that is a construct that the New York Times uses, and others use too, that is specifically designed to keep us at each other's throats, to make it much more impossible, much more challenging, much more difficult to have within one class, intra-class movement, and thereby keeping the New York Times at the top. It's maintaining an elite status. It's kind of ironic because the New York Times is actually falling apart. We just heard from Arlen yesterday how badly the media is doing. New York Times doing maybe a little better than some of the other media. Still, their ad revenue is way down. Yes, the internet has really harmed it, but the status that the New York Times enjoys, certainly within a certain circle, very, very high, but their share of the national pie in terms of the revenue is steadily declining. And yet they still promote a constructed dynamic that is harming them, that ensconces an elite class of billionaires and 100 millionaires and the like. So how do I know that Coleman Hughes is really on the side of poor, struggling, and working Americans, and therefore, in my view, is the opposite of a conservative who would presumably say we don't need to take action to help people. It's up to them. It's up to them to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And conservatives often do oppose DEI, but they don't say, well, then what we do need to do is help them based on income, which is exactly what Coleman Hughes does. He says we do need to help people. We do need to address need, but we need to do it on something based other than race. And the Times continues covering this TED Talk where Coleman Hughes spoke. We'll get to the TED Talk. This was a House subcommittee hearing where Republicans urged him to speak. And he said, we should have paid reparations after the Civil War. Of course, I agree 100%. People who were enslaved were subject to an extraordinary injustice. They were directly harmed by others. It's not they were forced to work without wages and beaten. I mean, the horrors are so tremendous. You don't, at some point, obviously don't really want to, we can talk about it, but I don't know that it does much except just kind of almost maybe inure us to human cruelty, just as I think some of us are right now inured to a degree by what Israel is doing to the Gazan people, how just cruel and almost close to sadistic that exercise is by Israel in Gaza. So I agree. Coleman Hughes is right. We should have paid reparations directly to the victims of slavery. But that doesn't mean that their great-great-grandchildren and the like should also get reparations. People have stories. We can tell Irish people were discriminated against when they came to this country. Now, you could make the argument that, and I think it would be fair to say that with the exception of Native Americans, Black Americans had it the worst. And we can see that in the specific ways that they have less in many ways, in many places, many areas than others. And therefore, we need to address those problems. But we can do it. We can address, in fact, we need to address the problems that disproportionately impact on Black Americans, such as poor schools, dangerous neighborhoods, and a punitive criminal justice system, which is exactly what Coleman Hughes is saying we should do, by helping based on income, by helping based on need. And that would, of course, disproportionately benefit or would address those who have disproportionately, the needs of those who have disproportionately been harmed by racism, and others as well. But if you're in a neighborhood that has poor schools, then you should have good schools. That needs to be addressed, period. End of story. If you're in a neighborhood where there's high crime, we need to have better policing. We need to have better community outreach so that those who may have few alternatives other than embracing a life of preying on others have those options, have an alternative. That's what we should be doing, and it should be done, certainly in my view, without regard to race. And that is a progressive view. That is the view that Coleman Hughes embraces. That is a progressive view. If you want more proof that this man whom the New York Times, I guess, they call him who is called progressive, whom the Times calls progressive. There we go. Who versus whom. I always have trouble with that one. You want more proof that he's progressive? Who's inspiring him? Is it George Will? Is it Richard M. Nixon? Is it Ronald Reagan? Is it Bill Clinton? It's none of them. If those were his models, his heroes, okay, yes. Maybe then you say he is conservative. He certainly seems to be inspired by them, but no. The greatest of all Americans is his inspiration, Dr. Martin Luther King. So again, how can you argue that, how can the New York Times fairly, justly argue that Coleman Hughes is a conservative? Well, again, he rejects focusing on innate identity characteristics, which is now de rigueur in progressive circles. And also, he has received a somewhat, I'll give this to the Times, a slight, very slight credit for this, in terms of, why they're calling him a progressive, because at least within some conservative circles like the Manhattan Institute, he's received a somewhat warm welcome. He's had to go to them to get, to be heard, to be seen, and he's gone to them. And, okay, I'm like, fine. People go on Fox News. That doesn't make them conservative. What you say, what you believe, for whom you fight, that's how we determine, or that's certainly how I determine, I think that's how we all should determine whether you're a conservative or not. But I think it's really important, though, to understand that we have institutions like the New York Times, but not just the New York Times, but we have institutions, progressive groups and the like, that really have made it very, very difficult to have a class-based coalition that rejects identity politics. And this is very, very destructive. But you can't even have this conversation. You can't even talk about these issues in many progressive groups. I've mentioned this before. Adolph Reed, an African-American professor at University of Pennsylvania, highly regarded, a democratic socialist. He's not a so-called black conservative like a John McWhorter or a Glenn Loury, who I believe also have a lot to add to the conversation. But that's not Adolph Reed. Adolph Reed is a self-described socialist, a Bernie Sanders supporter. And the DSA uninvited him from a conference because he wanted to focus on class-based, colorblind remedies, exactly the same as Coleman Hughes. So these gatekeepers, if you will, in the progressive movement, DSA, the organization I work for, Our Revolution, many others, you can't gain, people would be putting their pronouns in Zoom meetings. You can't, if you don't do that, people are like, well, what's going on? Why aren't you putting your pronouns? What, don't you support the trans community? And that kind of requirement of loyalty, of fealty to an identity politics that, while perhaps wildly supported on the left, among some elements of the left, and viewed, by the way, as crucial, is completely rejected by most Americans, and certainly a very significant percentage of the working class of all races. So these gatekeepers who say, Coleman Hughes is a conservative because he doesn't want to talk about race, which is, by the way, completely false. He says, and I get it, we should talk about race, but when we construct remedies for the problems, the very, very serious issues that are confronting so many Americans, it shouldn't, those solutions, those remedies should not be based on membership in a particular identity group. They should be based on income, which he says is the best way to lower the temperature of tribal conflict in the long run, using his word. Now, of course, I love the fact that he also uses the word tribal, because I often talk about tribalism, which I think is a really important lens to view people's perspectives through. I'm very, very upset, very, very disappointed by the positive embrace of Israel by so many Jewish people. I'm a Jew. I reject what Israel is doing. I condemn what Israel is doing. And yet, when I'm with family members, friends, they often are aghast at the views I take. And I attribute that, I ascribe that to tribalism. People say, I'm a Jew. That's my identity. That's my tribe. So I'm going to support other Jews. We have to do it. It's like in our genes, right? And that's true. That is, by the way, true. It's accurate. But it's also very, very dismaying, very, very disheartening. We have to move beyond that. But how hard is it to do that when the New York Times says, wait a second, you got to reject Coleman Hughes. He can't be in the conversation because he rejects DEI. He's a conservative. So again, I want to play that clip, the video with Bowie, where I think Hughes, frankly, really, really impresses. But I wanted to just get into, that specific quote, just a little bit more why I agree with this. And this is really important stuff, because if we want to move forward, if we want to build that coalition that can win elections, that can change our trajectory from a country which is burning more and more fossil fuels, which is engaging in endless war around the globe, right? Ukraine, we're certainly involved in that war. Whether you think we should be or not, we're involved. We're now involved in war in Gaza, which we're supposed to slaughter in Gaza. We're involved in war in Yemen. We bombed, I believe, Iran, Syria. So we're expanding global conflicts. We want to change that trajectory. Then I think we better listen to Coleman Hughes and start looking at income base. And income's not enough. There needs to be a focus also on wealth. And this is where, whatever online, I don't know if I show these clips or not, but loyal listener Jeff took me to task for allegedly calling for a wealth tax. I'm not really big on wealth taxes. I think we need, if you're alive, when you die, then the estate tax, which is on the wealth that you accumulated that is in your accounts when you die, is appropriate. But in terms of wealth taxes on people who are alive, it's kind of questionable because they, that money at one point or another was taxed. Right now, I would probably support a wealth tax because there's so much in so few hands, right? I mean, the Bezoses, the Musks, the Gateses, the Koch family, the Mars family, the Mars bar, Mars candy company, that kind of thing. They have so much money, these tiny groups of people, that we really should force them to disgorge some of it even before they die. But hey, I would be satisfied. You want to raise the top marginal estate tax to 99% on estates over $1 billion. I'm good with that. 100%. And that would solve the problem. It just wouldn't solve it today. It would solve it as we move forward. But maybe, if we can get support for that, that's fine. 240-242-5646. 240-242-5646. So the question was, would what Coleman Hughes says, is what he's saying correct? Would it in fact happen that if we addressed people's needs based on their income, and again, I would add wealth and also neighborhood, there's a lot of factors, and I'm big on guarantees, economic rights guarantees. If we did all that, would that really reduce the stress, the temperature around the country and around which we've seen rising and around the world? And I just don't see how there's an argument it wouldn't. It just seems so clear. So I wanted to get to, just real quick, I saw this column. This is something that Tom Edsall wrote. And when I read this, I was like, for some reason I thought, and I was hoping that maybe Jamel Bowie had written this, or maybe he wrote something similar, but I just couldn't find it. We're going to talk about Bowie a little later, so I would have loved for him to have written this, but apparently he didn't. He didn't write this, but something similar. So this is from Tom Edsall. You see Mr. Edsall contributes a weekly column. I just don't have his name there. Back in 21, should Biden emphasize race or class or both or none of the above? Now, it's very important to understand that one of the factors that I elevate, that I center, is winning. Getting policies that will make things better. Winning, passing laws, winning elections. Candidates that I like that will do what I hope, or I hope will do what I want. So I really, really prioritize winning. I also prioritize the truth. Sometimes you have to say, well, which truth? Whose truth? So if the goal is to have universal single-payer health care, Medicare for all, which I view as an extraordinarily worthy end because it will lead to better life for people who need it, people who are suffering, people who don't have enough. How do we get there? And this is something that Edsall looks at. And what he quotes to a study by these people named English and Calla. And they did this study where they surveyed all these adults and asked them about policies, including minimum wage hikes, forgiving $50,000 in student loan debt, affordable housing, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, to criminalizing marijuana and conviction. Now, I think if you look at those policies, you would say those are exactly the kinds of policies that if they were implemented would disproportionately benefit African Americans. They would benefit all Americans who are struggling, but they would probably disproportionately benefit African Americans and other Americans of color. because a disproportionate number of people in those categories are working for low wages, so increasing the minimum wage would help them. Forgiving student debt. I mean, I'm very lucky. Look at me. I'm white. I'm not saying all white people. A lot of white people have huge amounts of student debt. I know them. But even so, as I understand it, white Americans are less likely to have student debt. So forgiving that student loan debt would not benefit me particularly individually, although I strongly support it. I would forgive all of it. I don't think you should go into debt. There should be debt-free education. I would have, maybe some policy where there's some kind of wage dunning at a very low percentage, 1%, 5% of your income for a certain period of time to pay for college. And maybe that could be true for everyone. If you have a high income, you pay more. If you have a low income, you pay less. Maybe that's the best way to go. And presumably, because you go to college, you'll have a higher income. College grads do have higher incomes. So it makes perfect sense that if you have the benefit of college, then you pay for it out of your increased salary, a percentage of that increased salary. Affordable housing, obviously, that's going to benefit anyone who has trouble paying for an apartment or a house. So these are policies that are exactly what we need to start to balance the scales and to get a long way there. How do we get there? How do we get people to back them? We do exactly what Coleman Hughes suggests. We don't make those policies race-based. We make them income-based. And you can see just by the title, just by their names, that, affordable housing, $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all. Those are race-blind policies, debt-free education. Doesn't matter who you are. You bet it's not like reparations. It's based on not your membership in an identifiable race, ethnic group. It's based on your need. And I'm going to get into why I think there's a good argument, at least, one can make a very solid argument, I think, for some race-based remedies. I already talked about that, by the way, when it comes to trans people. There are certain, yes, Medicare for all would be a huge boon for trans people. And there are other policies too, good jobs program and the like, because many trans people have trouble getting jobs. So those are, universal programs, blind in terms of who the people are that are receiving it. But there are certain policies certain ways we need to specifically, I think, reach out to some of these communities. That's a little bit different, though. That's a little bit different than some kind of overt identity politics that treats every identity group as unique with its own unique set of needs that are often greater than those of people who aren't in that particular group. When Republicans hear about policies that will help all Americans, or that will help poor, struggling, and working class Americans, they are more likely to support them. So you see this, while among Democrats, both the class, so what they did is, and to try to build support, let me see, maybe I went to the wrong slide first. See if I can get this one on. So yeah, what I didn't share with you, I should have, is when they looked at they talked to these 5,000 people about about how these programs should be implemented. There were different ways they were spoken to. Some they were spoken to, the participants, about how they would help people based on their race. So some people read, oh yeah, Medicare for all would really help black people. And they should be helped because they have poor healthcare outcomes and less access to healthcare. And others just said working people, poor people, period, regardless of race. Then they talked, then they saw whether there was more support or less for the various policies. When it was policies that were discussed among Democrats, If you said to a Democrat, hey, this will help black people and it will help poor people, they would support it. But when the policies like Medicare for All, like a Green New Deal, were spoken of as helping people based on their economic status, Republicans supported them. But when they were told that, well, this will help black people, Republicans were less likely to support them. So the race frame had a negative effect upon Republicans. It's not statistically significant. So what that means is the class plus race was the issue that really turned off Republicans. Republicans don't want to hear about how policies will benefit one race. When they do, they are turned off. They're like, forget about it. We don't want it. Now, if you want to say that proves that Republicans are racist, go ahead. I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think for some Republicans, the view is, if they're white, is, hey, we're victims too. We don't want to hear about other victims. You know, tell us about, we don't want to hear about specific victims different than we are. If you just talk about class, we're going to assume that's all poor people, all struggling people. But if you start talking about race, then what we're going to do is think you're trying to help black people and not help us. I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying if you want to win elections, if you want to get your policy passed, if your policy is a good policy, which it is, which these are great policies, these are the policies that will make America a better place, then focus on how it will benefit everyone, or at least everyone who's not wealthy. That's the way you win. That's not what the New York Times wants to do. And why is that then? Why is the New York Times calling Coleman Hughes, who is specifically talking about income, who is specifically talking about class, why are they calling him a conservative? Why are they saying don't listen to him? Because they don't want to win. They really don't. They're not interested in redressing inequality. They're not interested in a truly just society where everyone has enough and no one has too much. And why not? Because they have more than their share. Because they're extraordinarily fortunate people. They have great influence and power. And they don't want to lose it. They don't want to lose any part of it. And they especially don't want to tick off their billion-dollar advertisers who don't share Coleman Hughes or yours or my view of what is a great society. For them, society is fine just the way it is. Now, let's get to this video. I do want to play it. I thought it was very, very interesting. I don't know if there's too much here that will require me to comment. Sometimes I stop it. Maybe I will a little bit. But I really just wanted to get this going. So let's see here. Always a little issue. I should, So very interesting. This was a TED Talk where they invited Coleman to speak along with Jamel Bouie. And by the way, it's very interesting. As I said, they're gatekeepers in the progressive movement, like the New York Times, like groups like DSA. They make it so hard to build a class-based movement because first and foremost, you have to, if they're going to take you seriously, if you're going to get to attain some sort of leadership or influential position in those organizations, you need to embrace an identity politics framework that is very off-putting to so many Americans. And by the way, not just white ones. We've seen from the support Trump is getting that kind of, from Latinos, from African-American men, that kind of identity politics is really not a winner, even among groups where it's supposedly, I guess, it's supposedly for them. It's supposedly designed to make their lives better. So this is from the TED Talk here. Let's see. Does color blindness, yeah, there we go. Does it perpetuate racism? Just the end of this. There's always little delays.
Thank you. And thank you for this really wonderful debate. This has been great. My position from the start has been that we need to target a particular form of inequality. We actually have to be attentive to that particular form of inequality. We are attentive to class inequality by addressing the relations of domination between groups. We are attentive to gender inequality by addressing the relations of domination between groups. But for some reason that when it comes to race inequality, we've decided that it is beyond the pale to attend to the domination between groups. And I'm saying that no, that's not the case at all. The constant recourse to individuals in this conversation, I think, is indicative of how very uncomfortable people are with thinking about this in terms of group inequality. That is my perspective.
So what Bowie is doing there is he's consistently conflating what he calls group inequality with group, with groups, down, undergroups and overgroups, basically. So there's systemic racism, there's systemic sexism, because it benefits the individuals in the group that are perpetuating it. And it harms the individuals in the group that aren't members of it. And there's some truth to that. But what it completely ignores is all the victims within the powerful groups. So there are plenty of white people who actually did suffer as a result of slavery. Their wages were greatly suppressed because they were competing against virtually, not completely, free labor. It wasn't like everybody benefited if they weren't black from slavery. Not at all. The Pullman Porters, I'm sorry, I was saying Coleman Hughes. The Pullman Porters were hired by the Pullman Corporation. They were African-American porters because they would work, they really had no choice but to work for lower wages than white people were demanding at the time. But because there was this pool of cheap labor, it meant that white workers' labor was also less well paid. So Bowie can't escape that framework of viewing disadvantage and advantage from a racial lens. And that just is simply won't do. It's just not sufficient. It's not enough. People's victimization is also based very much on their individual circumstances. Slaves should have gotten reparations. Enslaved people who were emancipated should have gotten reparations because they had been victims, every last one of them. They were individual victims of a horrible policy. Just like the Japanese who were interned were entitled to reparations for being interned, not because they were Japanese, but because they were interned. Those Japanese who were not interned, Japanese Americans, wouldn't have been entitled to reparations. So that's the answer to Bowie, and I think it seems pretty obvious and it seems pretty clear where he goes off the rails there.
Perspective here, and my perspective is that, and I would consider my perspective to be the perspective of Wendell Phillips, to be the perspective of A. Philip Randolph, to be the perspective of the luminaries of the civil rights movement, that we need to be not just attentive, we need to be both attentive to system-wide inequality, but also the specific consequences of specific policies meant to immiserate or degrade particular groups of people. It's entirely possible, and we've seen it, to have policies that address everyone, but leave those particular forms of entrenched inequality intact. And I don't think that we want that. I think if we want to...
I'm not sure what he's talking about. That policies that actually address everyone but leave in place injustices. Well, obviously, a policy that's ad hoc, for example, that provides Medicare for all, that everyone would get health care, isn't going to guarantee everyone housing. I mean, those are two separate issues. they're related, and the people who don't have enough housing are often the exact same people who don't have health care. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have Medicare for all, because it won't solve the housing problem. I mean, you could make the same argument with respect to reparations for slavery. It won't solve the problem of poverty. For some poor people, it will be a godsend, absolutely. But for plenty, it won't. And for some wealthy people, it will prove to be a godsend. So it's not addressing the current issue in society today, which is ultimately that some people, a very small number, have way too much, and many, many, many millions of people don't have enough.
A blind society, we don't want that.
Thanks very much, Jamel. And so now, Coleman, you get the final word. Your rebuttal, please tell us again why you are answering no to the question, does colorblindness perpetuate racism?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, there's been a very effective PR campaign against the notion of colorblindness, and I've tried to undo that meme for all of you today, partly by providing quote after quote of some of the great luminaries and activists, in many cases specifically using the word colorblind, and in other cases embodying the philosophy. I've heard.
All right, so let me just stop there for a second. So this is really important in part because it completely destroys what he just said, completely destroys the New York Times narrative that somehow Coleman Hughes is a conservative. He threw out, and you can go find this online if you Google YouTube, on YouTube, Bowie and Hughes, but the whole idea that this man who cites Dr. King and other civil rights leaders for the prospect that we need to work together, there needs to be a poor people's campaign, that somehow he is a conservative, is completely delegitimized. But the New York Times needs to present him as such because they want to discredit his argument and promote Bowie's, which, you know, Bowie worked for them. Because truly, truly addressing the injustice, the evil in America today means massive wealth and income redistribution from the few at the top, some of whom, not many, but some are black, to those at the bottom, many of whom, perhaps the majority, but certainly the plurality of whom are white, but a disproportionate number are of color. But that's how we would address injustice in America in the end. That's what is essential. That's what needs to be done. New York Times doesn't want that solution. The people who manage and run and own the New York Times, and even more importantly, I guess, to them, their advertisers, their sponsors, don't want that solution. They're the haves. They're the winners. They're the ones who are writing history. And their history is, if you don't support identity politics, if you don't support redistributing wealth and income based on identity, but based on need, then you're a conservative, which is ridiculous. It completely throws on its head any notion of what conservative and progressive means.
No analogous recitation of quotes on the other side, and I think that is.
So what he's saying there is, you said, Bowie, that, you know, people like A. Philip Randolph are on your side. I think A. Philip Randolph was a labor leader in the, I believe, railroad workers. I could be wrong about that, but he was a very important labor leader, African American. And what Hughes is saying, well, you say that they agree with you, but I'm the one who provided the quotes.
That is telling. Now, I also heard no retort to the problem created recently of Asian kids in Queens, you know, having to hide their racial identities. I mean, I think this is telling as well, because no matter how many abstract, you know, academic redefinitions and concepts one wants to use, in the end, race-based policy always comes down to looking someone in the face and discriminating against them because of something that they can't control. That is not the way to address the legacy of racism. It's not the way Martin Luther King wanted to address the legacy of racism. Ultimately, the way to fight racism cannot be to focus more on the alleged importance of race, It's to end race in policy altogether and focus on class. So thank you very much.
All right. So I don't know how anyone could think that somebody who says the way we address economic disparities is by focusing on class. I don't know how anyone could be called conservative who takes that position, but I guess the New York Times doesn't want you to talk about class, doesn't want you to think about class, doesn't want you to join together with others who have similar economic concerns and interests. And that's something I guess you just need to keep in mind, because when you read that newspaper and when you read other media, I want to get to one other. Well, we're getting towards the end, but I do want to play this video. This is with Abby Phillips. She is with CNN, because I really want to point out how the media does everything possible to avoid any kind of working class coalition, any kind of joining together. By the way, they'll do it. They'll break up identity groups as well. What Bowie and the New York Times are trying to do is unite black voters and I guess white liberal voters around the concept of race-conscious solutions to problems that we face. So they are, I guess, trying, pushing race solidarity. That's not what Abby Phillips is. Abby Phillips is actually trying to do the same as well in this interview, but also her goal is in the service of keeping individuals from voting their interests, from voting their class and economic interests, from voting their actual personal interests in this conversation she has with a Muslim American. And I also thought this was very interesting and really kind of sad. I don't know, what's the right word, disheartening. This is in response to the movement in Michigan among Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, I should say, but mostly I think they are Arab Americans, but there are Muslims, of course, from all around the world, not just Arab countries. This is a response to the movement to abandon Biden because he supports, to abandon, as he's known by many, and I think fairly so, Genocide Joe, to abandon Genocide Joe because he's helping Israel kill tens of thousands and starve over 1 million Gazans. And this is not going over well among Muslims. And you could say, well, that's identity politics. Oh, you don't like identity politics, but you're saying these Muslims are voting based on their identity. They're voting based on their interests. They don't want to see their co-religionists, their relatives, their friends being killed. They're not happy with seeing those people harmed. They're voting their interests. They're supporting their interests against those of Joe Biden's. That's the kind of the opposite of what Jamel Bowie was arguing. He was saying, well, we should all talk about race, not focus on the specific needs that poor, struggling, and working class African Americans have, and also poor, struggling whites and poor, struggling Latinos and poor, struggling Asians and everyone else who doesn't have enough. Here's Abby Phillips.
Joining me now is Abdullah Hammoud. He's the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, which is home to one of the nation's largest Arab American communities. Mayor, thanks for joining us. President Biden is in your state courting union members, but he did not meet with Arab Americans during this trip. Was this a missed opportunity?
I absolutely think it's a missed opportunity whenever dialogue can happen, constructive dialogue that can help save lives, because that's the conversation we want to have. And calling for a ceasefire and ending the bombing and unrestricted military aid to Israel, we want to save lives. We believe no innocent man, woman, or child should be killed.
And to that end, the White House says that it's deploying senior administrators.
All right, I'm going to stop it right there for a second. So you can see he's not focusing. This is a Muslim American. He's the mayor of Dearborn. He's not saying we're demanding that the president focus on the needs of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans. He's saying we want our people not to be killed. So it really isn't like an identity group issue. It's an issue of interests of the specific people who are being harmed and targeted by Israel. Not, we need you to put a Muslim American on the ballot. Not, oh, Kamala Harris, if she went to a mosque, that would be fine. We don't want that kind of lip service or that kind of performance. We want our policy, the policy that will stop the killing, to be implemented.
Officials to Michigan this month to discuss a number of issues with community leaders there, including this war. If the White House does extend an invitation to meet, will you accept it?
For anybody who wants to have a conversation about how we change course, that's the only condition, that there has to be a willingness and an openness to change course on what's unfolding now. Secretary Blinken just last week said that the Middle East is the most volatile it's been in 50 years. And that's that's due in part because of this administration's decision making. So if they're willing to come to the table with an open mind on how to change course, that's a conversation and dialogue that we can partake in.
All right, so I think that's a totally appropriate response. I want to just say she's going to push back. It's really important to understand. He's saying, look, what you're doing is creating an incredible powder keg in the Middle East. And that's what Mayor Hammoud is saying. You're creating a powder keg. And we've already seen it with all the bombing, not just in Israel, not just in Gaza, but in Israel and Yemen and Syria. We've got to do something different. We've got to do something better. This isn't good enough. So yeah, I'm happy to meet with Biden. I'm happy to meet with the administration, but not if they're just going to try to use this for a photo op, but if they're really willing to listen. And that's kind of my view too. I will talk to anybody, but I don't talk to people if they are coming on Halitics to persuade me of their view and they're not open to alternative views. They're not open to changing theirs. Everything has to be a dialogue. I'm sure Hammoud would be willing to say, okay, well, I don't think we should be killing all these. You should be killing all these Gazans. But if you want to talk about ways for Israel to enhance its security, I'll listen. He's not dogmatic. He's saying, I'm not going to meet with Biden and Blinken unless I know that they're not dogmatic either. Perfectly appropriate. You'll listen to Abby Phillips's response, and then I don't even need to comment because Hammoud just nails it.
Saying that you really only want to sit down if they say in advance that they are willing to change their strategy. Is that what your position is?
If you had a disagreement with your congressional official and you said you wanted to voice your concerns, and if they said, hey, I'll come listen to you, but I'm never going to change my mind, I think you yourself would say, hey, you know what? Let's just pass in this conversation and save both our times. But if there's a willingness and an openness to say, hey, you in Dearborn, you might know a little something. We come from these Arab countries that everybody keeps talking about online. The largest portion of the city of Dearborn is largely Lebanese immigrants, Palestinian, Yemeni, Syrian, Iraqi. In each one of these countries, we have lived through the firsthand accounts of apartheid, of occupation, of oppression, of bombardment, devastation, and bombing. And so we can speak from a firsthand accounts of what's actually unfolding on the ground.
By the way, sorry, Ms. Phillips, I didn't mean to block your face with my oval there, the Halitics logo. You sort of came on just after or just as I was putting it on the screen. So I'm sorry about that. That was an inadvertent mistake. But let's just hear a little more of this conversation here about how CNN is trying desperately to change the narrative from one of how Joe Biden is harming the millions of Gazans whose Israel's genocidal acts are killing, how he is hurting his own reelection chances, how his policies are harmful and destructive. Abby Phillips, desperate, CNN, and she's a good water carrier for CNN. Remember, she asked Bernie Sanders about, her question to Bernie Sanders about Elizabeth Warren was, why did you tell her that a woman couldn't beat Trump? She just assumed the truth of what was obviously a fallacious comment by Warren. She's a good foot soldier for the CNN suits, and she demonstrates it yet again.
Michigan Arabs and Muslims have launched a campaign, and they're saying abandon Biden, and they're urging members of their community to show up to the polls but not cast their vote for Biden. These efforts are also happening in other key states. This is, as I'm sure you know, going to be a very close election likely. Do you agree with this strategy, abandon Biden?
You know, for me, that question has to be put back to the candidate, to President Biden. You know, it's on the candidate. It's his responsibility to earn the trust and respect of the voters. I've run for office before. I've never pointed at the voters of my district and said, you're at fault if I'm not elected. In fact, it's me as the candidate. It's President Biden as the candidate to put forward a policy platform that is receptive to all of Americans. What we're asking for, a ceasefire, is not something that only the majority of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans support. In fact, over 60% of Americans support a ceasefire, over 80% of Democrats. And so for me, I would urge President Biden to heed the calls of Americans from coast to coast.
All right, such a great answer. Saying to Philip, going right back at her when she says, well, is it a good idea not to support Joe Biden? Well, that question presupposes that it's not up to Biden to attract voters. It's not up to Biden to promote policies that voters would like. It's not up to Biden to abandon policies that are opposed by the great majority of Americans, as Mayor Hammoud says, not just opposed by Muslim Americans, not just opposed by Arab Americans, but by the great majority of Americans. If he wants our vote, then he needs to change the way he does business. And again, this doesn't suit those who want to present a dynamic. It's a binary choice. You either get A or B. There's no picking off the menu. There's no saying, I'm not going to vote for either one. You have to choose. You've got a gun at your head. That's what CNN is telling the mayor. That's what CNN is telling Arab Americans. There's a gun to your head, and you either vote for Trump or you vote for Biden. And by the way, if you do vote for Trump, then you're going to blow everybody up. So that's the attitude of the corporate mainstream, quote, liberal, unquote, media. And Mayor Hammoud, to his great credit, is having none of it. And neither should you.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, certainly you want the president to change his position. I think one of the things that and I know you've gotten a lot of questions about this, people are wondering about realistically, what is the alternative, and what does that alternative mean?
Of course, there it is.
For the
be very afraid, be very scared. There's Donald Trump. And it's fair to point that out, but it's also fair to say, but be very scared. There's Joe Biden. We're looking at low-level nuclear wars in the Middle East and Ukraine with Biden as president. We have the highest production of oil and gas ever at a time when the planet has just passed yet another milestone in terms of CO2 emissions. So, I mean, does it even matter if you choose one or the other? They're both so bad. We've got to find another path. And those who say, well, I don't have the luxury, we don't have the luxury not to find another path. We don't have the luxury not to find another path.
Palestinian people, does it worry you about what a Trump presidency could mean for those lives that you said earlier? You're concerned about each and every one of the innocent people who shouldn't die.
And again, it's such a ridiculous question because those people are dying anyway. Oh, are you really? You say you're concerned about the Palestinians, but then you're going to turn the country over to Trump. Well, they're already dying. They're already living in an open air concentration camp. Joe Biden isn't listening to us. Joe Biden is doing the bidding of Netanyahu. And by the way, what we have seen is when there's a Democratic president, pro-peace movements tend to stagnate for very unfortunate reasons. Many pro-peace activists seem to think, wrongly so, or those who are willing to do something in support of peace when a Republican is in office, simply give up the fight when a Democrat is in power. So electing Trump could conceivably jumpstart a pro-peace movement a broader pro-peace movement than we've seen so far.
Saved.
Absolutely. I think Trump is a threat to American democracy. So the question should stand. What will President Biden do to prevent the unraveling of our American democracy? Why is being aligned with Benjamin Netanyahu and the most right-wing government in Israel's history worth potentially sacrificing our American democracy? You know, I had a resident that came before a city council meeting who had lost over 80 family members in Gaza.
I want to say that this is not going the way Abby Phillips wants it to go. There is no way this is going the way she would like. He totally, again, turned it on her. She's like, oh, if we elect Trump, aren't you afraid we're going to lose democracy? Trump is so bad. And he's like, yeah, it's a really serious problem. So maybe you better talk to Joe Biden and say, you better support some good policies that will really appeal to Americans and won't turn us off, that make it basically a terrible choice, whichever we vote for, whoever we vote for. And again, not going the way she wants. You can see her sort of grimacing. She's like, this isn't good. I'm not able to get him to just condemn Trump and say, well, you got to vote for Biden no matter what, the way AOC has said, the way Crystal and Kyle have said, the way I fear even Brianna Joy Gray might say. And she can't get Mayor Hammoud to say that, and she's not happy about it.
And the question in everybody's mind is, while we send our condolences for your loved ones, we want to know how you're going to vote come November. And I think that's extremely dehumanizing to think of Palestinian lives only in the context of polls. Well, Arab American lives and Muslim American lives outside of the context of just polls.
Well, yeah, I totally understand that. I think, but really what I'm wondering about is not about the polls, but do you believe genuinely that President Biden, I think the White House would say this, behind the scenes, that they're trying to...
By the way, I'm going to say Abby Phillip. There's no S at the end of her name. I just want to be very, very clear. It's Abby Phillip, not Phillips. For some reason, I had thought it was Phillips, and I think some people have called her that erroneously. But I don't want to misname her. So it's Abby Phillip doing the bidding of the corporate suits at CNN and saying, do you really think Biden's that bad? And how about what if we elect Trump? It'll be even worse. And how can you possibly say abandon Biden? And now she's trying a different course, and she couldn't scare him with the evil Trump boogeyman. Oh no, you're supporting. If you abandon Biden, you're helping Trump, and Trump's even worse. And his response is, yeah, Trump's really bad. So Biden better shift course, or we have to ask him, why is he risking electing Trump? Great question. So now she's shifting course. Well, but no, Biden's not so bad, is he? Don't you think he's really behind the scenes trying to get Bibi to change course? And of course, we know that's complete BS. If he wanted to stop the killing, all he has to do is stop shipping weapons today. Stop any aid from going to Israel right now. And guess what? They'd stop their killing pretty damn quick in Gaza.
To put pressure on the Israeli government to reduce the loss of innocent lives. Do you believe that at all, or do you think that that's not happening?
I believe those are political talking points. There's never been a war in history in which 80% of the country is absolutely decimated, where 100% of the population has been displaced, and where 50% of all the deaths are children. That has never happened. For us, we want action, not lip service. If President Biden wants to take a firm stance, he can begin by restricting military aid to the state of Israel. He can begin by calling a ceasefire, because right now, nearly 200 civilians are killed each and every single day. These are tangible steps that can be taken, because what we understand is only diplomatic efforts can lead to lasting peace and justice.
All right, Mayor Abdullah Hammoud, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
All right, so again, Abby Phillip, very unhappy with that interview. You can see how dismayed she is. The mayor making brilliant points. You can't vote for it. It's just not a moral decision. There's a moral imperative here that we not support genocide. And if you vote for Genocide Joe at this point, then you are doing that. And look, I'm not going to shame people. I'll say what I say. I don't see how it's in any way. People will say to me, well, how can you possibly oppose Biden? You're helping Trump. I would say, how could anyone support Joe Biden at this point? I think the mayor was so powerful, so persuasive. And if you want to look to your media, your preferred, believable media like the New York Times, the newspaper of record, and say, yeah, but look what the New York Times is telling us. The New York Times calls Coleman Hughes a man who says we have to address all these terrible problems facing poor, struggling, working class communities. We have to focus on class. We have to focus on income. They're saying that man is a conservative. They're not interested in the truth either. They're not interested in making things better. They're interested in perpetuating their elitism. It's sad. It's depressing. It's not something we want to think about, but it is the way it is. I'll be back tomorrow.